6-4, fractions, decimals, and percents. In this lesson, we're going to look at converting between fractions, decimals, and percents, being able to go between one form and another. First, we need to review that percent means out of 100. That is a very important key in the first thing that we're going to do, which is turning percents into fractions. If a percent means out of 100, 45% simply means 45 out of 100. 4% would be 4 out of 100. And 150% would simply be 150 out of 100. Remember, percent means out of 100, and when we turn a percent into a fraction, all of the denominators will always be 100. On this board, we're going to look at turning percents into decimals. Now, if we look at the first one, 45%, we could turn that into a fraction and make that 45 and 100, because that's what it is as a fraction. Percent means out of 100. And then to turn that fraction into a decimal, you simply read it. It's 45 hundredths. And that would be 45 hundredths. There's a shortcut to doing this. If we look at 45% and we put in a decimal point after the 5, although 1 does not exist there, there always is 1 there. And we take that, and if we're going to change a percent into a decimal, we can take that decimal point and move it 2 spaces to the left, get rid of the percent sign, and that changes a percent into a decimal. That's a shortcut. That's the quick way instead of turning it into a fraction and then reading that fraction. So we can use either method. I'm going to continue on through this lesson using the shortcut, which we'll use as perfectly acceptable. So using the second example, 8%, there is no decimal point, so we will put 1 in after the 8, and then we will move the decimal point 2 spaces to the left and fill in zeros as necessary. So 8% is actually 0.08. The third example, 0.5%, there is a decimal point there. So we're simply going to take that decimal point and we're going to move it over 2 spaces, fill in any necessary zeros, and 5% is actually 5 thousandths. 8%, the example above, is actually 8 hundredths. Our last example, 150%, there is no decimal point, so we will put 1 in after the 1's digit, which is a 0, and we will move the decimal point over 2 spaces to the left. 150% is the same as 1.50 or just 1.5. So you can use either method. You can go through and write them as fractions and then write them as decimals, or change them right from percents right into decimals. But I have a sneaking suspicion that I'm going to require you to show all 3 forms on your homework tonight anyway, so it's neither here nor there. Just showing you that there's 2 ways to do it. Finally, now we're going to turn decimals back into percents. We could turn the decimal into a fraction, which would be 35 over 100, and that simply turns into 35%. But we also have a shortcut for this type of problem as well. So over here we'll write the 0 and 35 hundredths again. Now we're going to take that decimal point and we're going to move it 2 spaces to the right to turn it into a percent. So we have 0.35, 35 100ths, and 35%, or we have 35 hundredths as a decimal right to 35%. Both methods work. Like I said earlier, you're probably going to have to show all 3 forms on your homework tonight, but recognize that you can make a shortcut. And we'll actually use the shortcut for the next 2 examples. So the next example is 0.007 or 7 thousandths. We're going to take the decimal point and we're going to move it 2 spaces to the right, and we end up with 0.7%. Our last example, 2.49. We're going to take that decimal point and move it 2 spaces to the right, and you get 249%. So we've already changed percents into fractions. We've changed percents into decimals. We've changed decimals into percents. And now finally the last thing we're going to do is we're going to turn fractions into percents. This one requires the most work. It's the most difficult because it actually requires you to have all 3 forms. So we're going to start with a fraction. We turn it into a decimal. And then we're going to turn that decimal into a percent. Because your fractions won't always be given to you in terms of 100 because they're not all written that way. Our example is 1/5. We know how to turn a fraction into a decimal by typing into a calculator 1 divided by 5, and you end up with 0.2. Now, using the trick we had from the previous board to turn a decimal into a percent, we take the decimal point and move it 2 spaces to the right and fill in some zeros. And that ends up giving us 20%. Your homework today is twofold. First, you're going to solve the problems on page 284, problems 16 through 50, all of them. Yes, I recognize that's quite a bit of work, but I want to make sure you get to see all 4 types of problems, fractions, decimals, and percents. And make sure you write them in all 3 forms for every problem. And then, finally, you'll probably end up doing this for homework tomorrow night, explaining in words and sentences how to change a decimal into a percent into a decimal, percents into fractions, and fractions into percent.